Good evening, and thanks to all of you for joining us. And special thanks to our guest, Sophia Cope, who I must say I can take a little bit of pride in because she's also a graduate of UC Hastings. So really terrific to have you here, Sophia. Well, let's jump right in. I mean, you are an attorney at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I'm sure a lot of people in the room have heard about that organization, but for those who haven't, why don't you tell us a little bit about the work that EFF does and your role there?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here. So EFF is a nonprofit organization. We are largely member supported. We have, I think, over 30,000 members right now. We focus on civil liberties. So generally we say civil liberties, but specifically we focus on free speech and privacy online and in relation to technology generally. We have 3 different program areas. So I'm, of course, on the legal team. We bring cases and also participate as amicus, so filing briefs in cases where we're not representing a party, but we want to influence the judge. We have that's also part of our legal team. We have folks working on legislation and direct sort of lobbying and legislative advocacy. Separately, we have an activism team that does a lot of public outreach and education. And then we have a whole team of technologists that not only help the lawyers and the activists get the tech right, but they also build tools to help people protect their privacy online. We do a lot.
Absolutely. And you know, one of the things that I think I've certainly become more conscious of in learning more about this area and talking to folks like you about it is just how integral electronic records are to our everyday lives and how much data we create almost in spite of ourselves. So when you mentioned the work that you do with technologists, I mean, if I just think about sort of what I've done today or what you've done today, tell me, when have I created data through my use of electronic devices, just so I can get a sense even of what we're talking about?
Well, sure. So how many people here have a smartphone? It's pretty much everyone. Yes, I do too. How many of you have a computer, laptop, desktop, etc.? Yeah. So basically anything you do on those devices, and presumably it's when they're connected to the internet, that's most definitely going to be recorded by the companies. Even on the device itself, if it's not connected to the internet, the device can store lots of data about apps you're using. And of course, you have like your emails and your text messages. You know, you can see that data. So there's sort of, I guess I would say, if you're using those devices on a daily basis, everything you do on the device is potentially recorded.
And I also drove in today to the office, and I notice more and more that when I'm driving around, I see cameras everywhere. So presumably those are also recording and storing data somewhere.
Yeah, so a lot of municipalities do have like traffic, probably what you're seeing are traffic cameras or red light cameras. And yes, they are recording. EFF tries to, with some of these programs, will work with municipalities to encourage them to have good data practices. So basically, don't collect that much data. Just collect the data that they need to enforce the law, and then basically delete it as soon as possible. So yes, I mean that's hopefully. They're not keeping that data longer than, just a couple of days. So
okay, so that's helpful. So it sounds like some repositories of data about me or that I've been created are sort of maintained and collected by government agencies or municipalities. But then presumably what's on my phone is generally being collected or tracked by the private company, either that built the phone or that built the software that I'm using on the phone.
Right.
What kind of interaction do you have with those private companies in terms of even figuring out in the first instance what it is that they are tracking and retaining?
Well, that's where our technologists help us to figure that out. But once we understand what data is being collected, when part of our advocacy is working with companies directly to, like I was sort of saying with municipalities, sort of encourage them to have good data practices. And there are lots of what we call privacy principles that we urge companies to adopt. So, like I said, sort of not collecting data that they don't actually need to provide the product or the service. For the data that is collected, they need to protect it, so encrypt it, prevent it as much as they can from being compromised by hackers. But of course, as we all know, that happens a lot. And using data just for the purpose that it was collected for, and not using it for a purpose that was not specified, being as transparent as possible with consumers about just all of these data practices. So that's why you see a lot of privacy policies, the companies have. So the bottom line is that we try to urge companies to be responsible with user data.
So it sounds like we've got, government entities that may be collecting data. We've got private entities that may be collecting data. Some of the government entities may ultimately ask the private entities for the data that they have collected for various reasons. And then you mentioned hackers. So we also have, criminals who want to access data that's been stored for various purposes. So EFF, as I understand it, works with companies to try to develop these best practices, but also, as you mentioned at the outset, engages in both advocacy and litigation to try to ensure that the government is not exceeding appropriate bounds in either its collection or use of our data. And I understand that a case that you've been working on recently involves government activity, and particularly government searches of electronic devices at the border. So I'd love for you to tell the audience a little bit about how you noticed, or how EFF noticed, that this was an issue that you wanted to pay attention to, and how you ended up bringing a lawsuit, and what's going on with that suit right now.
Sure. So I can talk about this for days, but I'll try to keep this as concise as possible. So EFF does a lot of work related to law enforcement access to user data and tracking and surveillance, and that's usually within the interior of the country. But over the last few years, we really started hearing, frankly, these horror stories from people who were coming into the United States. Sometimes it happens when people try to leave, but usually it's when people are coming back into the country, and border agents, whether from Customs and Border Protection or Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, ICE, either agency, but usually it's CBP. We were just hearing these horror stories about people trying to come back home, and basically their devices, were confiscated by CBP and rifled through. And to us, that just seemed like a utter, just egregious invasion of privacy. And really, these agencies have been operating without really any kind of legal restriction. So it's an issue that we are kind of monitoring, and we participated in a few amicus briefs, but it wasn't really kind of a hot button issue for a long time. If the iPhone just came out in 2007, so it's been just barely a decade. And so it's really just within the last few years, as the adoption of smartphones in particular has sort of gone through the roof, that we've really seen this phenomenon of almost every traveler has a smartphone, and sometimes also laptops and other devices. And really, just a lot more people have been reporting that their devices have been searched by CBP. So we were starting to look at this issue in 2015 and 2016, and because at EFF we get a lot of inquiries from just concerned citizens about things that are happening in the world. So we had a few inquiries, but really when the first Trump travel ban went into effect in January of 2017 is really when we got an influx of people sort of paying attention to our border policy and people who were caught up in the travel ban who were complaining about their devices being searched without any obvious justification. So we realized that this had really it seemed like it was really had become a problem that should be at the forefront of our attention.
So just to interject for a minute,
Yeah.
and to make sure we're all on the same page here, so essentially what's been happening is American citizens and legal permanent residents coming home from trips at the border have been required essentially by CBP agents to do what exactly?
This happens also to foreign visitors coming into the United States. But yes, there's a large swath of Americans who are caught up in this situation. But yeah, basically hand over their phone and unlock it, and the agents will look through emails, text messages, photos, whatever you have on there. So I have my whole life on my phone, so it wasn't a hard thing for me to imagine how violated I would feel if a government agent did that without any kind of justification.
And what would happen if someone refused to either provide the passcode or provide the device? Do you have stories about people who attempted to refuse?
Yeah, so it's with American, U.S. persons, so legal permanent residents or citizens, we are required to, or we are. We have to be let back into the country. So CBP is required to let us back into the country. Unlike a foreign visitor, a foreign national, CBP has a lot of discretion to prevent them from entering the country. But Americans have to be let back in. And so, yeah, if they don't cooperate, basically what we've seen is that first they're detained for a ridiculous amount of time. Like people will miss flights or whatnot. And then ultimately the devices are often confiscated. So one of our clients, his device was confiscated for like 11 months or something like that.
So folks are coming into the crossing the border, having their devices searched for no apparent reason that they can understand. And so then they call you at EFF and they say, look, this happened to me. And you start hearing more and more of these stories. So what do you do next?
Yeah, so, we put together a lawsuit, and we are partnering with ACLU National as well as ACLU of Massachusetts, because we ultimately filed in the Boston Federal Court. It's the Massachusetts District Court, but in the one in Boston. And we have 11 clients this is a civil case. We have 11 clients who are the plaintiffs. 10 of them are U.S. citizens, and one is a green card holder. And we are challenging CBP and ICE searches of devices under the First Amendment and the Fourth Amendment. And the Fourth Amendment is, for lack of a better phrase, sort of our lead argument, where by the traditional constitutional doctrine that has allowed border agents to search your luggage, for example, without a warrant, we argue that doctrine does not apply to devices. Because 100 years ago, when the Supreme Court said, yes, it's okay to search a suitcase coming across the border without a warrant, the idea was that, like, you might have a personal picture in there or some little bit of personal information, but by and large, you just have like your toiletries and your clothes, and like it's not really a big privacy invasion, right? And then the government's interests on the other side were like, okay, well, we're going to interdict drugs, we're going to interdict weapons, we're going to find goods that you're trying to import without paying proper duties. So there was sort of this balance that the Supreme Court made. But now we're saying that balancing doesn't match, or it just really is not appropriate. That same calculus isn't appropriate for devices. We have really unprecedented privacy interests in our phones. Like I said, our whole lives are on our smartphones and often on our laptops as well. And then the traditional justifications for interdicting contraband, you can't find drugs in digital data, right? So the government's interests are weaker on that side.
So you mentioned, 100 years ago, the U.S. Supreme Court weighing in on this question of sort of what searches can be conducted at the border because the Fourth Amendment is protecting us in the U.S. from unreasonable searches. And some balancing, obviously, is taking place there. So my understanding is you're not advocating for absolute privacy or absolute impossibility of border searches. So then the question becomes, what interests does sort of the current case law say judges should take into account? And has there been anything in the intervening 100 years to give us greater guidance on whether there's a difference between border patrols being able to open and search a suitcase for contraband and accessing information that's stored in the form of zeros and ones on these little mini computers that we all carry around?
Right. So we are trying to bring border search law into the 21st century, but we have seen in Fourth Amendment law related to law enforcement, what's happening with law enforcement, the interior of the country advance. So just in 2014, the Supreme Court came down with an opinion in a case called Raleigh versus California, and that was a case where the traditional exception for being able to search a person who's been arrested, like to search their pockets and whatever is on them, that without a warrant, like that the court said, if a cell phone is in the arrestee's pocket, that does not fall under the existing exception. There's separate privacy interests in a cell phone, and the police they can seize it, but they have to get a warrant to search it. So they can still continue to search the pockets of the arrestee to make sure there isn't evidence of the crime that could be destroyed, or like a pocket or a knife in the pocket that could harm an officer. That law still stands, but the cell phone, there are different privacy interests in a cell phone, and so the court said there needs to be a warrant. So we believe that sort of analysis is applicable, at the border.
And just for those of us who aren't steeped in sort of law enforcement procedures, so if I'm just walking down the street of San Francisco, can I be pulled over randomly by a police officer and have my person searched, or is there some sort of requirement? So what needs to happen in order for a search of my person walking down the street to be okay?
Well, just to clarify, what I was just talking about is that there is this sort of unique exception for arrestees.
Okay, so once there's if I've been arrested, then, so when you talk about an exception, the exception to the rule that I can walk freely through the city and not be searched by police officers would be carved out for incident to arrest, I guess, right, is what we would say.
Exactly.
So then what was the government's argument? If it was Riley versus California, it sounds like California authorities were saying, well, no, I mean, if the cell phone's in your pocket, that's on your person, so I should be able to look in your cell phone too. Was that their argument?
Yeah, that's what they ultimately wanted the rule to be, and like I said, the Supreme Court rejected that, and the court made very clear that when the court has created an exception to the warrant requirement, they do it based on very narrow justification. So as I was mentioning, which you're right, the search incident to arrest exception to the warrant requirement. That means an arrestee, someone who's arrested, a search of their pockets basically can happen without a warrant, and the court has said that that's for two reasons: to preserve evidence, right? So that to make sure evidence doesn't get destroyed, and also to protect officers. So to basically pat the person down, make sure they don't have a gun or a knife or whatever, and basically to protect officers. And so the Supreme Court said, okay, well, if we were to allow warrantless access to a cell phone on the arrestee, how does that match up to the original justifications? Is there an issue of preserving evidence? Is there an issue of officer safety in terms of allowing warrantless access to the cell phone? And so the government sort of hypothesized, like, well, there might be some text messages that could be remotely wiped.
So this is the access to evidence question.
And the Supreme Court was like, that's probably not going to happen. And if you think it's going to happen, just put the phone in a Faraday bag. Okay? Then the government said, well, maybe they could see something that indicates that the rest of the gang is going to come and jump the cops. And so that would be protecting the officers. So warrantless access to the phone would advance that interest of protecting officers. And the Supreme Court said, maybe, but that also doesn't seem very plausible. So the government was trying to put the cell phone under the search incident to arrest exception to the warrant requirement by trying to say that the original justifications for the exception matched up with, getting access to this digital data. And the court just didn't buy it.
So it sounds like, as recently as 2014, then we've had a sense reflected in this decision that cell phones are different, that you can't just analogize them to pockets and suitcases. So where do we go from there? You said they can be searched with a warrant. So what does law enforcement have to show in order to get a warrant and then search a device?
Right now,
yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, they can seize for an arrestee, they can seize the phone, and then they have to go to the judge and say, this is the preliminary evidence that we have that suggests that there is probable cause to believe that there is evidence of crime on this phone. And the whole point of a warrant is to have a really good reason to get at someone's personal data, and then actually to have an independent arbiter, which would be a judge or could be a magistrate, to say, yeah, actually, this seems legitimate. I'm going to allow you to go ahead and do this. And the problem at the border is that there's no process like that, that border agents have very, very broad discretion to stop anyone and everyone for any reason or no reason and search everything that they have with them while coming across the border.
So if I'm law enforcement, right, I'm thinking, but wait a minute, someone shows up at the border. I don't presumptively know much about them. How am I supposed to know enough about them to know that I need to go to a judge and get a warrant based on a probable cause showing if the purpose of wanting to access their phone is to figure out exactly who this person is and whether I should be worried about them?
Well, that was a very good argument. And that's basically what the government says. But again, under our constitutional jurisprudence, you have to consider the privacy interest in the thing to be searched versus the government's interest. And so we have, as I mentioned earlier, we have a situation where the privacy interests in our phones or other sources of digital data are so unprecedented. Think about, it's not just the kinds of data like text messages versus voicemails versus photos, but what does that information reveal about you? It's not that just like you went to vacation, you just went to Niagara Falls on vacation. I mean, that would be a discrete bit of information about you, but think of everything else, right? Your potentially financial records, or your financial status. How much are you in a lot of debt? What's your sexual orientation, right? Like what's generally your sex life, your love life, like where do you work? Who do you associate with, right? What do you do in your free time? And all of the inferences that can be made. Are you a good person? Are you a bad person? Are you a moral person? Are you an immoral person? All of that information can be gleaned literally from your phone at this point, right? And so to say that, the government should have unfettered access. Like you made the point, we're not saying the government should never get access, but they have to have a really, really good reason to. And when the traditional justifications for the border search exception to the warrant requirement were pretty much like interdicting physical contraband, like drugs, weapons, and like I said, goods subject to duties, import duties, that feels like a far cry from digital data, or digital data feels like a far cry from that.
One thing that you've spoken about and actually written about is the connection between these very specific rules governing when the government can and can't access our data, and broader ideas about sort of the kind of society we live in and the kind of society we want to live in. And we've been talking, for the last few minutes about the Fourth Amendment, which of course is a U.S. constitutional law provision that helps us figure out that balance in the United States. But we are at the World Affairs Council, so I want to shift the lens a little bit, and then we will come back so you can tell us where the case stands and what the next steps are. But before we do that, let's shift the lens a little bit. And I know, a number of us have been reading lately about this thing that's being referred to as the social credit score in China. And as you were going through the list of things that can be gleaned from my phone, that's something that came to mind. Can you, for those who maybe haven't read about it, can you let us know sort of what your understanding is of that and how that matches up to the sorts of things that any government these days could potentially learn about us from the fact that we are in our daily actions creating these digital records?
Right. So I just know what I've read, and I'm sure more reporting is going to come out, but it is very, very scary what is happening right now in China. This is like the ultimate digital dictatorship. For many years, for at least 20 years now, China has been building a very sophisticated surveillance network, right, system, like with cameras, actually surveilling internet activity, browsing activity. Now they've implemented with the cameras facial recognition technology, so they can actually know, who's walking down the street. So it's actually quite sophisticated, and so my understanding is that they are literally monitoring every citizen, because every citizen has a national ID number, and of course, like I said, through facial recognition, they can be identified, and they are monitoring what people are doing throughout the day, what they're purchasing at the grocery store, when they go to the doctor, or what they're doing in their free time, what their financial life is like, so monitoring all their financial transactions, and they're putting it all through an algorithm that basically, it's almost like a credit score, but it's like a social credit score. And if you have a really high score because you are really financially responsible and you are not a dissident, because I saw this article, an investigative journalist, his score has been dropped because he uncovered some corruption by some local officials, and now he's deemed to be a problem. But if you are not a dissident and you buy really healthy things at the grocery store and you have a pretty clean online record and you're not in some debt, well, then you get all kinds of benefits, I guess. I'm not exactly sure what the range of benefits are, but I think, maybe cheaper rent or better interest rates on credit cards, access to certain places or activities that other people aren't allowed to go to. It's really quite scary.
And it is interesting, is on the one hand, the notion of sort of, number one, this being run by the government, and number two, all of this information being filtered into and through an unknown algorithm that will produce sort of a number, presumably of some sort, seems very foreign, literally, right, and figuratively to our experience. And yet, we've been hearing more and more, haven't we, about, Fitbits and the data from various devices that we use and wear being filtered ultimately into our health insurance premiums. And there are companies now, right, that will track your driving habits, and that will filter into how expensive it is to be insured. And to a certain extent, of course, whether it's insurance policies or other kinds of price, variable price goods and services, we have always had to apply for those things. So a certain amount of information has always gone into sort of differentiating price among consumers. Sure. But this seems like, again, taking it to the next level of really kind of continuous monitoring of our activities.
Yeah, it's like I said, it seems to be becoming like the ultimate digital dictatorship, and for me, and I think my colleagues at EFF. I mean, it's very concerning because, we are trying to fight that from happening here, and obviously there are aspects of that have materialized and are manifesting. But just the idea of constant 24/7 surveillance, it's very concerning because you, on the one hand, you have like a government entity that is making inferences about, like in the China's case, and worst case scenario here, like you would have a government entity making inferences about us, then that could lead, they might be wrong inferences, and that could lead to some unfair treatment, right? So some unjust treatment. When people are constantly monitored, a lot, I would say maybe most people, we change our behavior. We try to be less controversial. We try to, which, sometimes be more civil might be a good thing. But, we are not our true selves. And I think at a more philosophical level, when like the worst case scenario is really a society where the government has all the information, they have all the power, all of the control, and we don't have space to be our true selves and to actually fight against the government if we feel like the government is acting in an unjust manner.
And you mentioned, to circle back to the case that you've brought, that there were both Fourth Amendment and First Amendment concerns that you raised. And am I correct in assuming that the First Amendment concerns have to do with this chilling effect that you've just described?
Yeah, absolutely. A concept under First Amendment law is the idea that that if you lose your privacy in your communications or in relation to who you associate with, then that will disincentivize you from continuing to associate with those people, or disincentivize you to, sort of cause you to do things differently or say things differently and not actually speak your mind and not associate with the people that you want to associate with. And that, that has consequences for individuals and for society.
Well, I think that the degree to which folks here are just so interested in what you have to say is reflected in the fact that I'm being flooded with note cards, which is lovely. These are all really fantastic questions, so I'm going to try to get some of them in the time that we have left. And a number of the questions are really curious about these 11 folks that you're representing, and also the many more people who brought to your attention the border searches that have been and are still taking place. Does EFF, have you noticed certain profiles of people who have been pulled out for searches of their devices? Does there seem to be a method to the madness, even if it's not a legally permissible method? Or kind of what kinds of trends are you noticing? Or is there anywhere we can look to get actual data in terms of figuring out what exactly is going on and who is being searched at the border, given that obviously not every single device coming through the border is being searched yet?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a couple, three responses. So our clients really come from all walks of life. So we have people of different races. We have in different religions. We do have a handful of Muslim clients. We have a couple of journalists. We have a former Army captain who's now a professor at a university. We have a NASA engineer. So we have an artist. We have a business owner, a computer programmer. So really the really egregious invasive border search practices really are affecting people from all walks of life. That being said, after, like I said, the first Trump travel ban, we did get a lot of inquiries or complaints from Muslim people, of course. So and like I have to do the math. I don't know, maybe 4 out of 11 are Muslim, I think. So it's not insignificant, but we don't have hard statistics on who actually are are being, what kinds of people, what types of people are being affected. We have aggregate numbers, so we know that in fiscal year 2017, over 30,000 people had their devices searched, and that's up from about 5,000 in, I think, 2012. So clearly it's becoming a much more significant problem. There are a couple of bills pending in Congress right now, and I know one of them, and these bills would require a warrant or at least some kind of heightened process to get access to devices at the border. I know one of the bills actually would require the CBP and ICE to keep statistics on the nationalities and the perceived either race and or religion of the people. So that would be illuminating.
So I've got a couple of questions here as well. Thinking about devices and the devices that we all carry, and the ubiquity of phones has certainly been reflected in the number of times that they've gone off in the last half an hour. So we all have them, and they do contain all of our information. Whose responsibility is it to protect that data, in the sense that, so one set of issues, and the one that we've been focusing on primarily so far, and the one that is at issue in your case is, what showing does the government need to make in order to demand access, essentially, for law enforcement purposes to our data? Another set of questions are, of course, and we alluded to, sort of commercial uses of the data, or the fact that data may be stored not for any nefarious or even commercial purpose, but then is susceptible to being accessed for nefarious purposes, including criminal purposes. So is the onus on each individual user to do his or her own due diligence to figure out how our data is being collected and stored? Do private companies have obligations in this regard? How do we figure out where the responsibility lies and what conduct is expected, leaving government to the side for a moment, of users and companies?
Well, I would say it's both. At EFF, we advocate for, as I sort of was alluding to earlier, we advocate to have companies be more responsible with data. And sometimes that actually means not even collecting the data in the first place. But to the extent that data collection is happening, there is some onus on the consumer as well. There are, through pressure, companies have provided consumers with more kind of granular settings, so if you go into your iPhone or your Android phone and you go into settings, you can turn off location tracking, for example, or turn it on just for your Maps application, but not for anything else. And if you're using a browser, you can delete your cookies each time you close the window, so that way there's not like ongoing tracking happening. So there is some onus on the part of the consumer to really kind of understand how do these settings work, and how can I manipulate them to suit my values and the things that I'm concerned about. But those settings didn't exist several years ago, right? So there had to be pressure put on the companies to even create those settings and those sort of granular data controls. So it's the onus and the responsibility to protect privacy is, I think, placed on both parties.
And we've definitely had, and you just offered some practical tips there, but we've had other requests among audience members for concrete suggestions. And I think EFF has developed not only some practical guides that you might want to mention to folks, but also some technological tools that can help facilitate user empowerment, really, when it comes to protecting our data. Could you mention some of those?
Sure. So in relation to border device searches, in I believe it was March of last year of 2017, we issued a travel guide, and you can find that under the white paper section of our website. And it's both a sort of a legal guide, but also a practical technical guide. So we urge people to think about what their sort of risk tolerance is, and sort of the risk factors that they might face when traveling abroad in terms of risks to their data and the chance that you might get stopped by CBP. And then we offer some different practical tips on how you can protect your data. So for some people, they don't need data while they travel, so they can upload it to the cloud and then download it at the destination. For other people, they do need data when they travel, so then we encourage people to encrypt that data and to have strong passwords to protect that data. So it really kind of varies. Our practical tips vary on what privacy considerations apply to you. And then tools. So we do have several free tools. So probably our most popular one is called Privacy Badger, and that's basically a browser extension that blocks tracking. So when you go from website to website, it blocks third parties from tracking your browsing activity. So
let's switch over. We've been, painting a pretty rosy picture of privacy and a somewhat negative picture of government intrusiveness and company tracking and use of our data. But one of the lovely things about this co-sponsored series is that we've had the opportunity to have our guests come and speak with UC Hastings seminar students on Thursday afternoons in my seminar on democracy, technology, and security. And so we had a lovely conversation just before this event with our students. And, some points that were made in that conversation, both with the students and with another privacy lawyer who joined us for that conversation was, some consumers are okay with not having complete privacy. We talked about ad tech, where, you probably everyone in this room is getting quite personally targeted advertising at this point. And the positive side of that, right, is not only that the companies that are generating the ads are, presumably more likely to have those ads shown to people who actually buy their products, but also from the user experience, you're seeing stuff that you're actually interested in. Similarly, on the law enforcement side, the creation of all of this data, wouldn't it be a shame to think that all of this information is out there? And I think this is actually something that was raised in the 9/11 report. Had the dots been connected and they were there to connect, we could have prevented a real national tragedy. So I know those are two very different things, but can you talk a little bit about some of the positive uses of data collection and how EFF or just, private citizens can maybe start thinking about the ways in which we might want to allow for those positive uses as well?
So, there's no doubt that there are positive uses, helpful uses for technology. What I like to think about is what is the default? And if you just look at the Fourth Amendment, it has a default of privacy, that the government has to basically jump over a few hurdles before the police, for example, can raid your house and go through all of your personal papers and look through your filing cabinet or whatever. So if in that case the government has probable cause to believe that you have committed a crime, the law enforcement's going to go to a judge and show the preliminary evidence. The judge is going to sign the warrant, and then the police are going to come to your home. And so but I don't expect the police then to come to my home or someone else's home just because they feel like it, just to go on a fishing expedition. That there has to be some, targeted reason why that particular person's privacy is going to be breached, basically. So, and then in that kind of a situation, clearly there's a benefit. Like either a crime is being investigated, any kind of crime. We want crimes to be solved and people to be prosecuted. So that's a beneficial use of data, right, of information. But the idea is that we have some sort of barriers in place, so that way government agents are not, just sort of bulls in a china shop, whatever metaphor you want to have, you want to use. It's just that they are constrained and are targeted and will not violate privacy unless there's a really good justification for it.
All right, well, let me press you on that a little bit, Sophia, because I mean, to go back to the 9/11 analogy, it's great to be able to solve crimes, but isn't it better to be able to prevent them? I mean, shouldn't we be bringing to bear all of the tools that we have to try to keep citizens safe? And, a couple of the questions talked about national security in particular, and there's a whole kind of history of our vocabulary these days about what we consider law enforcement and what we consider national security, but to kind of be less technical about it. If government potentially has available to it the ability to survey, for example, a huge swath of data and detect, whether it's through human study or algorithmically, likely places where crime is going to be higher, or individuals who may statistically have a greater propensity to engage in violent crime. Why wouldn't we want the government to use those tools? Setting the Fourth Amendment aside and just kind of thinking about, to go back to the theme that I mentioned earlier, the kind of society we might want to live in.
We could live in that society where there's just sort of like when we were talking about China, like where there's just mass surveillance all the time, and it's not about only solving crimes; it's also about preventing crimes. I mean, and preventing of terrorism or crimes. I mean, that's okay. I mean, yes, we want that to happen, but again, it's like, do we want to be in a society where everything we do 24/7 is monitored and logged and and analyzed and inferences made? And I don't know, that seems very scary to me, because they might find a terrorist with sort of unfettered access to all of this data, but they also might squash dissidents, or they might make a wrong inference that will send someone to jail, unjustifiably. So I think there really are real risks if you take that to the logical conclusion. So,
in terms of the role of companies, a couple of interesting questions have come up about how we figure out what kind of society we want to live in, right? So we've been using the royal we up here, right? But of course, different people may have different views. And there are, as I understand it, a number of conversations ongoing, and in particular, conversations ongoing under the auspices of GNI, of the Global Network Initiative, which I gather you helped to launch. So can you tell us a little bit about that initiative and the kinds of principles and who is involved in the discussion around those principles, and where is that conversation heading?
Sure. So I would say that well, I'll tell you what it is, so then I'll explain how it fits into the bigger picture. So the Global Network Initiative is what we call a multi-stakeholder initiative or program where tech companies, civil society, so NGOs, nonprofits, and other interested stakeholders come together to really try to figure out how tech companies can be better at protecting human rights, and specifically free speech and privacy. And so GNI itself is a program whereby certain tech companies, so I think like I know Microsoft's involved, Google, and like a couple other major ones, and then some other some European companies, where they agree to abide by certain principles, and then they're evaluated on how well they comply or try to meet those principles. But the main goal is to push back on governments when governments ask for make censorship demands of taking down content online, or ask for data about users, that the companies are required to push back as much as possible to make sure they're valid requests, that the law is actually the requests are consistent with law. If they are consistent with local law, then they have to be consistent with human rights. So there are lots of different considerations that the companies have to make to, just like I said, really just try to promote privacy and free speech online as much as they can. And that's just actually one initiative in this bigger concept, within this bigger concept of business and human rights, or corporate social responsibility. So like EFF has kind of a project that we call Know Your Customer, because a few years ago it came out that a lot of American companies, as well as some European companies, were selling surveillance technology to repressive governments like Iran or Vietnam or Russia or whatever. And these companies were making a lot of money, but at the end of the day, their products were being used to squash democratic dissidents, protesters, etc. And that, that's problematic if you have the worldview that, democracy protesters shouldn't be, shot in the streets because, they were tracked down in their homes and, disappeared or whatever. So we advocate for sort of a due diligence kind of methodology whereby technology companies should try to understand what the supply chain is and who their ultimate customers might be. Or if they go into a new market, they need to understand, okay, well, how does this government operate? What are the local rules? Like, do they have a history of human rights abuses? And if we operate in this market, are we going to be subject to or be forced to comply with some of these bad practices? So it's just generally this idea that tech companies should do their best to protect human rights as much as possible.
Well, and you mentioned, as part of the GNI initiative, Google. And my understanding is that Google, for many years, has not offered search capability in China precisely because of the censorship that would have been required of it. And yet, lately, there's been reporting that there may be an imminent shift in that perspective. And I think you and a couple of your EFF colleagues have written about that. Can you, in the few minutes that we have left, maybe talk a little bit about, as you were starting to allude to, but in this more concrete way, the responsibilities of tech companies, many of which are just down the street from us?
Yeah, so some of you might have heard of Project Dragonfly. It's what they're calling their possible new search engine that they would launch in China, and it would not actually index certain websites according to, sort of a blacklist provided by the Chinese government. And of course, that violates at least Western notions of freedom of speech. And what's been really interesting, and not just with Google, but with this has come up with some other companies that, and you haven't really ever seen this, at least not in the tech sector, but you're really seeing the kind of pushback start from within the companies, where you have the engineers or other employees saying, you know what, we don't want to build these kinds of products. We want to build cool products and interesting products and useful products, but we don't want to build a product that's actually going to contribute to human rights or civil liberties violations. And so what has happened with Dragonfly is that I guess there were a few people at the top who knew that this was happening, and then it sort of leaked out to the rest of the company. And there has been a lot of internal dissent within Google. Similarly, there was Project Maven, where there were some engineers who were helping with the U.S. drone program, and there are national security. Some people would argue there are good national security reasons as to why we have drones, but at least with with these particular people in Google, they saw drones as basically, a weapon to kill people, and they didn't want to contribute to building out or improving those weapons. So it's interesting. So we basically we support the employees. We write blog posts. If they're calling out their leadership for taking on these projects that are quite questionable in terms of civil liberties and human rights. We want to support those. We want to support those employees, and we'll see what happens. I think Google said that they weren't going to renew their DoD contract for the drone program, but they have not really said what they're going to do with their Chinese search engine. So we'll see.
Well, and I'm sure there are also folks arguing that more precise drone technology is actually beneficial, because then you are more likely to hit your actual target and cause less collateral damage or civilian casualties. Folks who would say, well, better that folks in China have access to some of the internet, even if not all of the internet. And so these are really difficult issues. I think that I'd like to give you the last word, and I think a note I'd love to encourage you to end on is an observation that I think we both had, again, discussing with UC Hastings law students some of these really interesting issues, and noticing sort of a difference in the room among folks about their expectations of privacy. The kinds of trade-offs that they expect to make in our society, the kinds of protections that they want the government to provide, and the kind of information that they feel comfortable sharing. And I certainly know as my kids are getting older in this generation of smartphones and laptops and all of the rest of it, are we going to get to a point where this technology is in fact so ubiquitous that we no longer have these expectations of privacy, and you and I are just going to be dinosaurs in the room? Where do you see that heading, and what can you tell us to make us feel better about that?
Well, I would say that we should always expect privacy. That to say that we have to give up privacy to get a cool app or to get, some national security benefit, that just doesn't have to be true. That we should be able to have both, that we should be able to have the default expectation that what we do in our lives and even online specifically is generally protected from the prying eyes of a company or from the government, but that at the same time we can give, like in this case, you were saying national security, give the government the data it needs in a precise, targeted way to fulfill its obligations as the government to protect the general welfare, and to suggest that we have to completely give up one in order to get the other. I don't believe it, and I urge all of you to continually push back on the government and also maybe private companies to say, let's figure out a way to do this better, right? So I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you so much, Sophia Cope, for being with us tonight. We're going to finish up our recording, but we've just learned so much from you, and I've really enjoyed our conversation. So let's give her a round of applause.